Hi, my name is Marvin. I'm a PhD student of history here in London and a tour guide, and tonight we are going on the Ghosts, Ghouls and Gallows tour here through London. And this these are the posters that we'll talk about.
Oh no, this was out in the middle of the minutes.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, we are now in front of our next stop. We are now in front of this beautiful building here, St. James's Palace. It is still an official royal residence. Now, it's mostly used as an office building for the royal family, but somebody who still lives here, partially at least, is the king's sister, the Princess Anne. And of course, we cannot enter an official royal residence. We have to stay in front of it. But this palace here behind me wasn't always a palace. It started originally in the Middle Ages as nothing else but St. James's Leper Hospital and was run by monks of the Catholic Church. And I'm pretty sure some of you think now, okay Marvin, stop talking already, I've got it. All the people who died from leprosy, they are haunting the palace, let's move on. But no, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not that predictable. I'm not telling you anything about leper ghosts here. Those people just died and they are more or less happy now. They don't do anything anymore. But then in the 1530s, England had a very, let's say, special monarch. I'm pretty sure you might have heard about this king before, as long as you know the name Henry VIII. And Henry VIII had a great idea back in the days. He wanted to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. But the Pope merely declared no. So Henry simply created his own Protestant Church of England to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, to marry his second wife, Anne Boleyn, more on her later on at the Tower, of course. And he also confiscated all the Catholic territory here in England, including the leper hospital, just to figure out that running and owning a leper hospital wouldn't be any fun at all. So what did he do? He demolished the hospital to build a new, warm, modern and comfortable palace for Anne Boleyn, for his second wife. Yet poor Anne never saw the finished version of this palace because, let's say, she was unable to keep her head for long enough to do so. But then even Henry VIII couldn't create any ghosts for this palace here. It took someone else to do the job for him roughly 300 years later, namely this young gentleman here in a red British uniform and a more or less wild hairdo. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is Ernest Augustus, the Duke of Cumberland, one of the many, many children of Mad King George III. Now, what was going on? In one night in 1810, Ernest Augustus spent a lovely night in one of London's many gentlemen clubs, further down there in Pall Mall. And ladies and gentlemen, just for more clarification here, when I personally talk about a gentleman club, I mean those old conservative establishments where back in the days only men met to discuss politics, to read the newspapers, to play cards or pool and all that. I do not mean the establishments with the metal pole in the middle of the room. Now, be that as it may, in this particular night, Ernest Augustus enjoyed himself a bit too much anyway. He played some cards with his friends and he gambled a fortune away, which wasn't too surprising for him at all. He was known to be a larger-than-life character. The Duke of Cumberland loved his food as much as he could eat. He loved his alcohol as much as he could drink. And of course, he loved his female company as well, as many as he could get his dirty hands on. The problem in this night, however, was that he wasn't losing his money. He lost the money of his father, King George III. So Ernest Augustus for once had a smart idea in his life. He decided that maybe it might be better to not go back home to Buckingham Palace after a night like this. His father might just give him a royal headache the next day. Maybe it would be better to spend at least one night in here in St. James's Palace, or however long it took really for the whole situation to calm down again. But the problem was that Ernest Augustus never spent a full night in this palace. He felt a bit strange, a bit uncanny about all of that. So he ordered that his good old friend and valet de chambre, Joseph Sellis, would also need to spend the night in here, in the bedroom immediately next to the one of the Duke of Cumberland. And this, ladies and gentlemen, wasn't surprising either. As valet de chambre, it was Celis's job to pick the clothes for Ernest Augustus in the morning, to help him getting dressed in the morning and undressed again and ready for bed in the evening. Because you know, when your father is a king, you cannot do that on your own. And once the two men arrived here, Ernest Augustus went a step further. He became so nervous all of a sudden that he ordered that not a single servant working in here in this particular night would be allowed to go to bed all night long. If Ernest Augustus had any reason to feel afraid in here, then the servants would be ready and prepared to help him. And after the order had been given out, Joseph Celis prepared Ernest Augustus for bed, and Ernest Augustus went to bed and fell asleep. Celis went into the bedroom next door and fell asleep. And ladies and gentlemen, what shall I tell you? Nothing was going on at all. Everything was quiet. After hours, the servants grew tired, hungry, thirsty, frustrated. So they went to the palace kitchen to eat and drink a bit. And of course, this was the point when something was going on. Suddenly, Ernest Augustus started to shout out his lungs up there. So the servants, they rushed upstairs again. They stormed into the Duke of Cumberland's bedroom, where they found him sitting on his bed. His arms were both wounded and bleeding, and he just kept on shouting at them, "Joseph Celis, Joseph Celis!" So one of the servants wanted to run next door into Celis's bedroom to see what was going on, but he couldn't open the door. It was locked from the inside. The servant had to throw his whole body weight repeatedly against the door to open it. Now that worked. The servant was in the bedroom, and in there he discovered Celis lying in his bed, dead, because his throat was already cut through all the way down to the spinal column. The head was almost completely chopped off. Fresh blood was still flowing out of the wound, and the once white bed sheets were almost completely red. And of course, as the king's son was involved in such an incident, the royal court ordered merely that an inquest should be conducted immediately to figure out what was going on in this particular night. An inquest was conducted. The report about it is now in the royal archives at Windsor Castle. And if you want to read it, it's there. But what's in there is the following. In this particular night, the inquest concluded, Celis must have taken a saber, a sword, and sneaked into Ernest Augustus's bedroom to attack him with this saber for whatever reason. Yet, as Ernest Augustus was a brave and experienced soldier, he managed to fight off Celis, who in return only managed to wound the Duke's arms, hence they were both bleeding. And as Celis was now losing the fight which he started, he ran back into his own bedroom and locked the door. He was now afraid of any potential punishment. After all, he attacked the king's son, and in order to escape the punishment, he took his own saber to cut his throat, to kill himself, and nobody could punish him any longer. May I now ask you though to please put your hands high up if you think that this sounds like a believable chain of events. Perfect, you are much better than many other ghost tours. And ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly what many noble people, many courtiers thought back in the days. And they paid some people, some servants who had to clean Celis's bedroom to get some more information. And indeed, they got some information which didn't really help the first report to make much sense. For instance, we remember Celis was found dead in his bed, whereas his saber was found next to the bedroom door at the very other end of the bedroom. And next to Celis's bed stood a china bowl filled with water, and the water was red from blood. So the servants, the courtiers, they thought if all of this was true, then Celis would have needed to not only cut his throat, he would have needed to press the blade all the way down to his spinal column, to then tear the saber out again, to throw it away, bleeding out now of course, to then go to the china bowl with water to wash his hands clean while it's bleeding out, and go back to bed and continue bleeding out in bed. Now this, ladies and gentlemen, was probably not what was going on here. So the courtiers came up with an alternative. Maybe Joseph Celis was attacked in this particular night by no one else but Ernest Augustus, the Duke of Cumberland, with a saber. But as Joseph Celis was indeed a brave and experienced soldier, he managed to fight off Ernest Augustus and managed to wound the Duke's arms, hence they were both bleeding. And as Ernest Augustus was now losing the fight which he started, he merely decided to make use of his love for food. And he sat down on Celis to press the blade of his saber all the way through Celis's throat, down to the spine, almost cutting off his head. The only question these courtiers couldn't answer at once was why on earth would Ernest Augustus do that to his good old friend and valet de chambre. But they found the answer quite quickly, and the answer was called Elizabeth Sellis, Joseph's young and beautiful daughter, and coincidentally also Ernest Augustus's mistress. It's affair. He was already married at this point, and now young and beautiful Elizabeth was also pregnant. And of course everybody knew who the father was. Yet Ernest Augustus didn't want to take any responsibility here, and the only person back in 1810, a man of course, who could have challenged this decision was no one else but Elizabeth's father, Joseph. So it would appear that Joseph needed to die just to make sure that Ernest Augustus could continue with this, let's call it liberal lifestyle, in the gentlemen clubs further down there in Pall Mall. And after Elizabeth heard that the love of her life not only left her alone, but then also killed her father, Elizabeth became really desperate itself. And back in 1810, she saw no other way out of her misery but to kill herself and thus her unborn baby child with her. And ever since these quite tragic events back in 1810, female members of staff working here at St. James's Palace reported that in some nights they want to have seen Elizabeth walking along the corridor of the palace, stroking her pregnancy womb. Yet, as soon as any man, for instance a male member of staff, would join this group of women, then Elizabeth would merely disappear, because obviously she still doesn't trust any men even after more than 200 years, and arguably who can really blame her for all of that. But her father, Joseph, seems to haunt this place in his very own way, because his bedroom is the coldest room in this palace, and people working here say that it sometimes smells like fresh blood in there. And someone who believed in all of this already about 200 years ago, was 150, was no one else but Britain's most famous ghost hunter ever, and Ernest Augustus's own niece. I'm talking about Queen Vicky again. And Queen Victoria had a very peculiar punishment for British courtiers or foreign guests of state if they dared to offend Queen Victoria at court in Buckingham Palace. In this case, she merely ordered that the so-called Sellis room would need to be prepared for at least one night. Whoever dared to offend Queen Victoria had to spend one night in Sellis's former room, in his former bed, but at least now with freshly washed bed sheets. And ladies and gentlemen, we do not know exactly what's going on in there because nobody wrote a report about it. We only know that it must have worked because it didn't take that long and Queen Victoria didn't need to use this as a punishment anymore. So we can say that at the very least it was a subtle but proper lesson on good British court etiquette. Yet I have a reason for, or a solution for you rather, to find out what's going on in there. You merely need to befriend our new king, Charles III. And as soon as you achieve this goal, you must offend the king as terribly and as quickly as you possibly can. Then he might force you to spend at least one night in the palace here, in Sellis's former bedroom. And ladies and gentlemen, the good news is that the survival rate in this room is 100%. Unlike 50 Berkeley Square. So the next morning, or whenever you are allowed to leave the room again, you can find me, tell me about your experience, and again, I will make your story part of this Ghouls, and Gallows tour, and all of London and the whole world will know about you. But before we now make our way to our next stop, St. James's Park, I have a quick question. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, as I just said, we are now in front of our last stop for tonight's tour. We are right now in front of the infamous Tower of London, just over there. A building which is almost 1,000 years old. It goes back to the reign of nobody else but William the Conqueror. After he, well, conquered England in 1066, he wanted to have a royal palace and a royal fortress, which was built over there. And officially at least, the tower is still exactly that, a royal palace and a royal fortress. Of course, the king and his family will never ever live in there. The tower is not that fashionable and warm anymore these days. Yet, over the course of its long history, the tower wasn't only a palace and a fortress. It was, as you might know already, a torture chamber, a prison, and an execution site. Of course, we will talk about that in a short moment. Yet, it was also many more positive things. It was, for instance, the Royal Mint, the Royal Armory, and Sorry, some people are unfamiliar with that fact. The tower was also London's very, very first zoo. From the Middle Ages up until the 1820s, the English and later British monarchs kept their very exotic pets in the Tower of London. And in the 18th century, in the 1700s, the tower was actually open to the public, the zoo that is. People could pay an entrance fee to see the king's or the queen's pets in there. The entrance fee was either 3 halfpence, or if people didn't have that much money, they were always allowed to bring a cat or a dog with them to feed the lions.
Oh
with
my
these
God.
poor animals, ladies and gentlemen. To give you 2 animal tragedies related to the tower, in the late 1200s, England's king, Edward I, received a present, a gift, from his friend and colleague, the King of Norway. And this present proved to be a polar bear cub. And King Edward doted on this polar bear. He just loved the little fellow. He went so far to order a blacksmith here in London to make a long iron chain with an iron collar to actually chain the bear to the wall facing the Thames so that the polar bear could swim in the water and catch some fish. The good news is that the polar bear's collar became bigger when the polar bear grew. So that was the good news here, but we do not really know what the polar bear thought about being chained to a wall. What we do know though is that at some point the polar bear was an adult, it wasn't just a cub anymore. And Edward forgot to put up a sign reading, "Please beware of the polar bear." So when the polar bear was old and tall enough, it used to climb onto the boats of local fishermen close to the tower. And now try to imagine that. You are a medieval fisherman or fisherwoman minding your own business. Suddenly your boat starts to shake. You hear a splashy noise behind you. You turn around and you see a 1990s fully grown Coca-Cola advert. Now obviously the people didn't like it, and once the polar bear died, no one was sad about it. Apart from King Edward himself, he never got over his loss, that he lost the polar bear, that is. But just a couple of years ago, there was another animal example related to the tower, because archaeologists discovered the skull of a fully grown elephant here in the Tower of London. Now this never happened before and people were incredibly excited. So once again, archaeologists, historians and scientists worked together. They did some archival research and some tests, and they figured out that what they discovered there was nothing else but the skull belonging to the pet elephant of King James VI of Scotland, who in 1603 became King James I of England. And King James had this elephant, but unfortunately in the early 1600s, people here in Britain didn't really know much about elephants. They were debating what to feed to this elephant, and King James thought he knew best about everything. He merely ordered the beekeepers, the guards living and working here in the tower in their red puffy uniforms, to feed his elephant with a royal diet every day. And back in the days, a royal diet involved loads of red meat and liters of red wine every single day. Now please do not ask me how the beef eaters managed to force feed the poor elephant, but they actually did. And after merely 2 months in the tower, the elephant actually died from liver poisoning at the age of max 2 to 3 years. Which means, ladies and gentlemen, King James is as of yet the only English monarch who holds a very sad record in England's history. He's the only one who managed to kill an elephant by making it drunk every single day. But, ladies and gentlemen, as bad and as sad as all of this might sound already, I prepared, just for you of course, 2 more human tragedies related to the tower's long history as a prison, a torture chamber and an execution site. Both of these tragedies are in chronological order, but in my opinion we will also start on the more harmless out of these 2 tragedies, just to make our way tonight to our most gruesome tragedy related to the tower, maybe even the most gruesome tragedy which you heard all night long. I will leave this to your judgment, of course, and both of these tragedies also take us back to the days of course, King Henry VIII. He had to feature properly at some point. And our first tragedy, the fairly harmless one, is the one surrounding this beautiful young lady here. I'm pretty sure many of you saw this portrait before. This, of course, is Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife. And you might know that we heard about her earlier at St. James's Palace already. She was the one for whom Henry wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon, his first wife. She was the one for whom he had to create his own Protestant Church of England to be able to marry her. And then, although he loved her so much at the start, at the beginning, in 1533, and dared to commit the ultimate crime nonetheless, the ultimate crime in Henry's opinion, that is. She dared to give birth to a daughter. How could she? Henry demanded a son. He didn't care for this girl to be the future Elizabeth I, so he and Anne tried again and again to get a son. And Anne became pregnant again and again, yet she merely miscarried all her other pregnancies. And neither back then nor nowadays were doctors 100% sure why this was the case. Over the centuries, the explanations ranged from venereal diseases to genetic disorders, maybe even on the part of Henry VIII himself. But ladies and gentlemen, I must be honest, I'm not a doctor, so when doctors do not know for sure, neither do I. What I do know as a historian, though, is that by 1536, Henry merely had enough of Anne. He wanted to get rid of her, but he couldn't find a legal or semi-legal way to do so. So he merely declared that he found the solution why Anne was miscarrying all her children. Because he merely claimed that Anne must have cheated on him with at least 10 other men. And now cheating on the King of England was treason. And now God was punishing her for her treacherous behavior. A very easy solution, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, when your king is Henry VIII, after a jousting accident, a paranoid man, you do not want to debate that for too long when you are his advisor, of course. So all his advisors simply said, that's all right. And 10 men, among them Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, and the gay court musician, were taken to the Tower to be tortured until they all confessed that they were traitors. And ladies and gentlemen, you might also know that under torture, people usually confess quite quickly. All of them confessed after a couple of days in the Tower, and they were all sentenced to death. Yet before they were executed, Anne was taken to the Tower as well. Not to be tortured physically, she was still the queen after all, but she was forced to observe all of these 10 executions. And now please try to imagine that for a short moment, if you have siblings, you are forced to see how their heads are cut off in front of you. And after all these 10 men were dead, Anne was also sentenced to death. Yet Henry still liked her a tiny little bit at least, so he ordered that the best executioner should be brought over from good old France. As this executioner wouldn't use an axe, he would use a long sword, as supposedly this made executions swifter, less bloody, less painful, just better, ladies and gentlemen. And Anne was told about this, shall we call it a privilege, and she merely replied, thank God I have a thin neck. Now, the day of Anne's execution arrived though, and she was executed behind these walls in the Tower of London, which, ladies and gentlemen, you shouldn't underestimate. It was a privilege to be executed in there, because only members of the elite were executed in the Tower, and only members of the elite had access to observe these executions. They were fairly private. The public ones, where really everybody could watch, they took place on the other side of the street over there, behind all these trees. There you would find Tower Hill Tube Station. And Tower Hill Tube Station was formerly just Tower Hill. It was the public execution side of the tower. Now Anne was brought to the scaffold here in the Tower of London. She walked up there, and before she was blindfolded, her French executioner knelt down in front of her, asking her for her forgiveness, and of course granted it due. She didn't have another choice anyway. Then the executioner from France got up again, and the lady in waiting blindfolded Anne. She had to kneel down to say her last prayers, and almost immediately after she was done with them, Our French executioner got his long sword. He swung it once, and indeed, he was a master of his questionable art. It took him merely one blow, and Anne was decapitated. Allegedly, the cut was so clean back then that her kneeling and praying body remained in this position for about 20 more seconds before the nerves realized that the brain had just gone. Then the body collapsed and her headless body was buried in the St. Peter's Chapel here in the tower, where her body remains until this very moment. It had never been removed to be buried in Westminster Abbey or Windsor Castle. Yet over the centuries, people living and working here in the tower reported that they want to have seen Anne in some night walking through the tower or along the premises, and my favorite sighting dates back to 1873, when a soldier who was stationed in the tower was on his night shift. He had to patrol through the whole tower at night time to see that everything was safe, and he claimed the next morning that he saw Anne walking along the premises of the tower carrying her head under her arm. Which, ladies and gentlemen, is also the reason why I think it is the more harmless tragedy, because clearly Anne is in a better position than Red Rosie from St. James's Park, because Anne obviously found her head already, whereas Red Rosie still needs to find it and just needs to put it back to where it once was. But, ladies and gentlemen, as I said, this is also, in my opinion at least, the fairly harmless tragedy. I would say I can become a bit more bloody and gory than that when I tell you about the tragedy surrounding this not so young lady here. And ladies and gentlemen, this here is Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury. And when I say not so young anymore, I mean incredibly old for Henry's days. Because when Margaret was executed, she was 65 years old, which for the 1500s is almost ancient. To relate a bit better to that, 65 in the 1500s is roughly 85 to 90 nowadays in 2023. So incredibly old, I dare say. And Margaret was actually a popular noblewoman here in England. She was known for her donating to the poor. She was known for her charitable work. Yet, she had two problems, of which the first one was a minor one. She decided to remain Catholic in a time when Henry wanted everyone to become Anglican Protestant. But Henry dealt with that quite well. He merely thought, this lady is so old, she will die any day now, and the problem is solved once and for all. The bigger problem was her son Reginald Pole, because he was a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church. And of course, a Roman Catholic cardinal would never ever say that Henry, rather than the Pope in Rome, was the head of the Church of England. So the cardinal faced being imprisoned here in the tower on the charge of being a traitor. Yet, thanks to his good mother, the cardinal still had some friends here in London, even at Henry's court, who helped him to escape. He made his way to France, where he found refuge at the court of the Catholic French king. And of course, Henry was told about all of that. He was outraged. He negotiated with the King of France to get the cardinal back to England as quickly as possible. Yet the French king, as a devout Catholic and as a proper Frenchman, back in the days he loved annoying the King of England, essentially merely replied no. And the cardinal remained in France for the rest of his life. And Henry was now incredibly angry, just to calm down again, because then he remembered, didn't the cardinal's old mother still live somewhere in England? If I can't have the cardinal, I will just go for his old mother. And Margaret Pole was imprisoned in the tower on no charge whatsoever. Henry didn't even bother to make up anything. But once she was imprisoned in the tower, Henry forgot about Lady Salisbury, because a rebellion broke out in the north of England. The people there decided to remain Catholic. They were not too happy with Henry's religious policies, so Henry had to send the army and the good and experienced executioners up to the north to deal with this Catholic rebellion. And once all these expert executioners were not in London anymore, Henry was reminded by an advisor that Lady Salisbury was still in the tower, waiting for her head to be cut off. So Henry signed the death sentence. But remember, the good executioners weren't here anymore, and what was to follow now was, according to the records, the most messed up execution which ever took place behind these walls. Now, on her execution day, Margaret was told that she had exactly 2 hours to prepare herself for her execution. And what did Margaret decide to do? She decided to wear a white dress to show to the world how innocent she actually was.
Sorry.
And after 2 hours, she was taken to a scaffold here in the tower again. So just like in Anne's case, a very private, privileged execution. And Margaret was taken to a scaffold. She walked up there, where she was then asked to tip her executioner, which, ladies and gentlemen, might sound a bit strange to a modern audience, but back in the days that was absolutely normal. People would always tip their executioners to make sure that they would do their jobs as quickly, as bloodless, as safe, as sound, well, safe as possible. You know, nowadays people would probably tell you, tip your delivery or taxi driver, or the guys in the hotels helping you with your heavy luggage. Back in the days, people would have told you, always tip your executioner. And Margaret did exactly that. She spat at his feet. And this made the executioner incredibly nervous, because first and foremost, he was nearly 16 years old. So far, he only ever practiced on pigs and vegetables. And now his very first human victim was this very old, very obstinate, yet in my opinion also incredibly courageous lady. He ordered Margaret to kneel down and bend forward so her head and neck would be on the block and he could cut off the head. And Margaret refused to do so, claiming, "No, for traitors kneel, and I am none." The executioner was so inexperienced now he didn't know what to do anymore. So his assistants stepped in, and they were experienced. They didn't ask any unnecessary questions. They simply forced Margaret to kneel down, and they forced her to bend forward. And then our young executioner got his axe. He approached Margaret, he lifted and swung his axe, and he hit her between her 2 shoulder blades, ladies and gentlemen. And I think we can all agree that the execution was messed up already now. The executioner's king was Henry VIII. So who knew for how much longer the executioner himself would survive all of that? He became more and more nervous. He wanted to lift and swing his axe again, but he couldn't. It was stuck in Margaret's back. He actually had to place 1 foot onto Margaret to press her down to be able to lift his axe, which worked, but he stumbled a couple of steps back. And Margaret Pole was now incredibly excited and full of adrenaline. And ladies and gentlemen, I claim we have all been there. We have all been wounded, excited, and thus full of adrenaline. So we know what this hormone can do to our body. Never mind how much we are harmed or how old we actually are. Now it seems that Margaret's plan now was that whilst her executioner was stumbling back, to get up, jump off the scaffold, run out of the tower as if the gates weren't locked, to live happily ever after. Because she actually got up despite her wounded back, and she approached the edges of the scaffold. Maybe she wanted to jump, we wouldn't know, because our executioner was quicker. He approached her a second time, swinging his axe a second time, this time a bit deeper though, to hit her calf. And Margaret fell down, still lying on the scaffold, still being very much alive, just not very mobile anymore, ladies and gentlemen. So our executioner approached her a third time, swinging his axe again, hitting her again, yet no vital body parts still. Somebody who observed this execution back in the days was the Spanish ambassador. And he wrote a report about all of this to his king in Madrid. And according to this Spanish report, our young and inexperienced executioner took in total no fewer than 11 blows before he was able to cut off Margaret's head completely. And according to this report, Margaret kept on screaming in pain and agony until her head had been completely removed. Afterwards, the headless body was buried in the St. Peter's Chapel here in the tower as well, close to Anne's body actually, where Margaret's body remains until this very moment too, because it would appear that once you are executed in the tower and buried there, you will never leave this building again, ladies and gentlemen. Margaret's head, by the way, remained in the tower as well, because back in the days it was normal to feed the ravens with the chopped off heads. This is how the ravens were kept in the tower back in the days. You might wonder, what do we do nowadays to keep the ravens there? Well, rest assured, we do not chop off any heads anymore, ladies and gentlemen. We claim to be a bit more civilized nowadays. We merely clip the wings, ladies and gentlemen, which is maybe a bit better than chopping off people's heads. But over the centuries, people living and working here in the tower reported that almost regularly they want to have seen an unidentified old woman in a white dress walking along the battlements of the tower just over there. Now it seems we are safe tonight, but these men, or people in general, who claim that they saw this unidentified old lady, also say these days that now this white dress is stained by red spots. And I go as far as to claim, ladies and gentlemen, that if this unidentified old lady is the Countess of Salisbury, Margaret Pole, then the red spots might well be blood, indicating to us where our young and inexperienced executioner hit Margaret at least 10 times before he was able to cut off her head with the final 11th blow. Yet I always prefer to end this tour on a fairly light note. And you might wonder what on earth happened to our young teenage executioner. And maybe you are delighted to hear, ladies and gentlemen, that the young boy survived all of that. He wasn't executed himself, and even better for him, he didn't need to apply for another job. He was actually allowed to continue in his profession as the King's executioner in the Tower of London, because obviously quality standards were lower in the 1500s than they are nowadays. We can only hope that a certain English proverb applied to all his victims after Margaret Pole, namely, practice makes perfect, ladies and gentlemen. Yet, although this was also the last tragedy for tonight's Ghosts, Ghouls and Gallows tour here in London, and although I do hope that I could keep my promise that at least here at the Tower we started on a fairly harmless tragedy, just to end tonight's tour on the most gruesome one related to the Tower, maybe even the most gruesome one of all of them tonight, I do not want to send you away just yet. There are a couple of things which I would like to address if you allow me to do so. I promise I will try to keep myself as short as I possibly can. I try doesn't mean I will manage. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the first thing is that in case you enjoyed tonight's Ghosts, Ghouls and Gallows tour here in London so much that you would actually like to tell others about it and maybe even recommend the tour at home, then I would be incredibly grateful if you could leave me with a review on TripAdvisor. And there are a couple of ways to do that.